This country has existed under the Constitution since 1787. It's been challenged before, but the guardrails of democracy have held. I think the guardrails of democracy are being challenged right now more than ever before in history. But I'm hopeful, as you say, that lawyers are going to bring the challenges and fight back, that the courts will continue to uphold those challenges against the Trump administration. And in the end, the Supreme Court of the United States will play its role of enforcing the Constitution.
Hi, welcome back to Just the Facts with me, Jill Wine-Banks, the Watergate Girl, and today with Professor Erwin Chemerinsky, a distinguished and wonderful professor of constitutional law from UC Berkeley, who has written some of the most amazing and wonderful, insightful things about the Constitution, about the Trump administration, about the problems that we are all having now. And he and I are going to talk about a few of the many things that he's written about that I am, and I know you are, concerned about. And I'm going to start with something a little lighter because May 1st is just around the corner. And it's a time when lawyers are supposed to renew their oath and maybe protest about what's happening to lawyers and law firms. Erwin, I want you to know that my law firm was Jenner & Block. So we're one of the good ones. We're standing up for democracy. We're standing up for the rule of law. But I know you've written about how many law firms aren't and how sad it is. So, maybe let's talk about what lawyers can do on May 1st to show that they believe in the rule of law.
Let me start by saying it's such a pleasure to get the chance to talk with you. I think it's so important that lawyers, that all of us speak out against the unconstitutional actions we've seen in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. I think lawyers are going to need to continue to be the guardrails of democracy. I taught my last class of the semester this morning, and I said to my students that if our democracy is going to hold, it's going to be because there's lawyers that challenge unconstitutional actions, and there's judges then to enforce the Constitution. And so I think that part of speaking out is there are going to be rallies all across the country. Lawyers need to attend those rallies. Lawyers need to educate the people about the law. We need to go to Rotary clubs and Lions clubs. This morning, I talked to a fourth grade class about the Constitution because we've got to inform and educate people at all ages, at all levels of education. We just can't be talking to each other.
Well, okay. So you mentioned one thing that concerns me, and that is the courts have been really good about saying that Trump is acting illegally, unconstitutionally, but there is always this fear of what if he does not obey? I'm from the Watergate era. Richard Nixon obeyed when the court, in a unanimous decision, said you have to turn over the tape recordings, even though he knew that those tape recordings would end his presidency because they showed his guilt. He gave them to us. We're not seeing any evidence that Donald Trump is going to obey the law. So talk about what do we do in that case?
Every president in history has obeyed court orders, even when they strongly disagree. You talk about how Richard Nixon complied with the court order, even though it ended his presidency. Dwight Eisenhower complied with court orders, even though he disagreed with them in ordering federal troops out to desegregate the Little Rock schools. Franklin Roosevelt obeyed court orders, even though they were striking down New Deal programs. I know many people have said, well, Andrew Jackson said, quote, John Marshall made his ruling, let him enforce it. People should know Andrew Jackson never said that.
Right.
That it was attributed to him 20 years after he died. And about the case, it was an order to the state of Georgia. It wasn't even an order to Andrew Jackson. So when we're talking about the possibility of a president defying court orders, we're talking about something to be unprecedented in American history. So far, the Trump record is inconsistent. On the one hand, there are instances where President Trump has complied with court orders. A week ago Saturday at 1 a.m, the Supreme Court, in a case called AARP versus Trump, said no additional people shall be taken to Venezuela until further order of the court. The Trump administration has complied with that, so far as we know. On the other hand, there have been a lot of federal court orders to resume spending that was illegally cut off. It appears that the Trump administration is either slow walking it or not complying at all. And while at times Donald Trump has said he'd comply with court orders, remember he also said that he who saves the Constitution
Yes.
violates no law. What happens if the president defies a court order? Well, as you know so well, courts have the power of contempt. There's criminal contempt. The difficulty is usually that's prosecuted by the Justice Department.
Right.
But there is a provision in federal law that allows a federal judge to appoint somebody else to prosecute criminal contempt. The difficulty with criminal contempt is the president can pardon any sentence for it. Then there's civil contempt.
So wait, let's stop there for a second,
Please.
because I want people to really understand the importance of what you're saying. Donald Trump can tell his staff, don't comply, don't release the money, keep deporting, whatever he wants to say. And he has immunity, sad to say, although I think the immunity is more limited than he wants to believe it is. It has to be a core function, otherwise it's rebuttable. And I think in these cases, the power of the purse is so clearly in Congress that refusing to release money that Congress has appropriated would fall in that rebuttable area. But his underlings don't have that, but they do have the knowledge that he will pardon them. So now we've said if he violates it, maybe there could be contempt, but he pardons the contempt, so there's not really contempt. So then you go to civil contempt, which means you don't go to jail until you comply, although you could go to jail until you comply rather than be fined. So there is a possibility of his staff going to jail, isn't there?
Yes. It would appear that the president can't be held criminally liable for contempt or civilly liable for contempt, though I agree with you that's unclear, in part for the reason you say, and in part because the Supreme Court in Trump versus the United States, or the case about civil liability, Nixon versus Fitzgerald in 1982, didn't discuss contempt. And I would make an argument that contempt so goes to the core judicial function that there shouldn't be presidential immunity. But setting that aside, you're right. Those who carry out the president's orders could be held in contempt. Civil contempt is they could be fined or even put in jail until they comply with the court order. Now, the one catch on that is traditionally it's the United States Marshals who are part of the Justice Department who carry out the civil contempt. What might happen if a judge says to a Trump official, you're in civil contempt. I'm putting you in jail until you comply with my order. And then the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, says to the marshals, don't carry out the judge's order. What we're talking about is a constitutional crisis unlike this country has ever seen. And what's chilling is we're not very far from it.
And, you've written about the possibility that we need a new constitution. Now, one fear that I would have is that the new constitution would reflect the rightward bent of many states and that it's a high risk. But I think the reason you're saying we might need a new one is that there are so many glitches that the Constitution was written on the belief in the rule of law and that the president would always obey the rule of law. No one ever anticipated Donald Trump and that he would ignore the rule of law. So do we need, it's not just that emoluments don't carry a penalty. Yeah, it's illegal, but so what? But what do we do about all the things that he's doing that seem to be beyond his powers, and yet they're happening and no one's stopping him? Is there anything Congress can do?
There's so much in the question. Let me try to go step by step. The most important is, as you say, what we're seeing now is unprecedented in American history. We should never forget that this isn't in the range of the normal or the usual. When we think of the things that Donald Trump has done in the first 100 days that are clearly unconstitutional and illegal, locking people up in El Salvador and saying that no court can grant review, eliminating federal agencies created by federal statute, refusing to spend money appropriated by federal statute, deporting individuals because of views they express, punishing law firms solely out of retribution, cutting off money to universities without following the law in any way. We've never seen this before. The second part of your question is about the new Constitution. I don't think this moment is the time to draft a new constitution. I think we have to fight right now just to preserve the existing constitution. But there will be a point in time when we need to think about a new constitution. No constitution lasts forever. And I think we need to carefully contemplate what the procedure would be. And I think it can't be the procedure in Article 5 of the Constitution, where it has to be approved by 3/4 of the states. I think it would have to be something that isn't provided for in the Constitution, a national popular vote about whether to ratify. But that's down the road. That's not imminent. Finally, in terms of what people can do, I think people need to inform themselves. People need to get involved. There are organizations that are challenging all this. They can use volunteers. They can use financial support. People are part of clubs and groups. They need to be part of this. And we've got to find every way we can to speak out. It's really the democracy of the United States that's at stake.
And I think there's more that we can do than just speak out. I really feel like, for example, any state that passes the equivalent of the SAVE Act, the voter restrictions that they're planning on, people in those states need to help people get the proper documentation, because not everyone has the computer capacity or knowledge to be able to get those documents. Not everybody has the 150 or whatever it costs for a passport. And so we should take up some fundraising to pay for that, so that no one is denied the right to vote because of a lack of finances. And no one is denied because they don't have easy access to their voter, to their birth certificate or their marriage certificate. Because for women, my birth name is not the same as my legal name right now. And so if I have a birth certificate, I still can't vote unless I change my name back to Jill Susan Wine. And I don't choose to do that, but I would then have to have my marriage license as well. And I think everybody's got to think of some small thing that they can do in their community to help solve some of these problems, whether it's in voting rights or whether it's in immigration protection. The most important, well, let's talk about, what do you think the biggest threats are? Is the lack of due process, is that the biggest threat? What are the biggest threats right now? And how do we let people know that these threats really are going to eventually impact them? It's not just people who had tattoos who were rounded up on the street. We don't know that those are Venezuelans. We don't know that any of the gang symbols or the tattoos they have are actually gang symbols. They didn't have any chance to come to court and say, I'm a gay makeup artist and this is an autism tattoo. So is that the biggest problem, or is there something else that's bigger?
Well, let me start by agreeing with everything you say. I agree with you in terms of an example of how people can get involved in helping those in states that are restricting voting. I agree with you in terms of why we have due process, why we don't just give the government the power to decide who to arrest and deport or who to arrest in jail, because we don't know if the government is making a mistake. That's what notice and hearing and due process is all about. In terms of the greatest threat, there are so many. Let me point to two that are very different. One is what you alluded to, the government claiming the position to take people, put them in a maximum security prison in El Salvador, and claiming that no court in the United States can grant review. As Justice Sonia Sotomayor said, in fact, as a conservative judge, J. Harvey Wilkinson said, if the government can do this, it can even round up citizens and put them in a gulag in El Salvador. And the Trump administration position is, and no court can do anything about it, because then they truly can come after you or me or anybody and lock us up in El Salvador. We've seen countries where that's happened.
Yeah, none of the countries that we emulate. We don't want to emulate those, but
that's exactly right. And so to me, it's most chilling that they're really claiming the authority to do this. Unless anyone listening think I'm exaggerating, Donald Trump himself and Secretary of State Marco Rubio himself said that they want to be able to put citizens in the maximum security prison in El Salvador.
It's incredible. And could I ask you one question?
Sure.
That's been bothering me, which is, when we look at the number of people who are now housed. First of all, I don't want to call it a prison because they were not given due process rights. They didn't have a trial. They weren't convicted. They weren't sentenced. They've been transported to a third country that has nothing to do, apparently, with any of them. Maybe one of them was El Salvadoran. And this was on a contractual basis. This isn't foreign affairs. There are private prisons in America. They could have been contracted with to house these people, but they weren't. They chose a place that is more like a concentration camp with no facilities, no rights. They haven't got the right to talk to their own family, to talk to their lawyers. They've never had a hearing. Isn't this just a contractual thing? And how can anybody seriously go to court and say, I have nothing, I can't do anything, this is foreign policy? This isn't foreign policy. Stop paying them and they'll release these people.
You put your finger on something important. If they were put in prisons in the United States, no one would dispute that a court could order their release on habeas corpus. Why did the Trump administration decide to put them in El Salvador? It's certainly not that there's a lack of prison capacity in the United States. It's the Trump administration did this deliberately so they could say, once they're in El Salvador, no federal court has any authority to do anything about it. This is all about the Trump administration trying to establish the power to imprison people outside the scope of judicial review. The other thing that you have, please.
You're frightening me, but go ahead. Keep
Well,
going.
it should be frightening. And that's why if you ask me what I put at the top of the list, the other thing that I put at the top of the list, because it's going to affect so many people in this country and abroad, is the arbitrary cutoff of funds. We've cut off funds for the United States Agency for International Development, and people are going to die in foreign country because they're not going to have the medical assistance or humanitarian assistance the money provided. In this country, the cutoff of funds for things like Medicaid, where there's been a great reduction, it's going to cause people to die. The cutting of medical research money in this country, which is just unfathomable to me, is going to make it harder to find cures to diseases and people are going to die. The cutting of staff in the Social Security office is going to mean that people aren't going to be able to get the benefits that they're entitled to. This is where we're going to see a tremendous human effect. And so that's why I put it so high on the list of awful things that Trump has done.
No, I think that is a seriously top of the line. But, I was in thinking about talking to you, I was like making a list of what's the worst. And every time I thought of something I thought was worst, I thought of 10 more things. I mean, it was like, okay, ignoring a court order, that's bad. The separation of powers and the power of the purse being taken away from Congress and Congress letting it happen, shame on them. Birthright citizenship, which is clearer in the 14th Amendment. Due process, 5th and 14th Amendment. Firing randomly. Think of the danger of what he's done. He's fired people in the middle of the bird flu epidemic who were in charge of protecting against that. He's firing people from every department planes are falling out of the sky. I'm not a scared flyer, but lately, I got to say, I get on a plane and I think, I hope the FAA person has been there for a long time, that it's not some new replacement. Those are firings that under civil service laws should not happen. And then there are all the firings of people who have a term of office. You get appointed to be the inspector general for 6 years, and he doesn't like you because you aren't going to do exactly what he says. He fires you. That is a danger. The threats to the courts, to lawyers, to judges, the fact that judges have to think about their own safety and making. And then, I can't help but think about tariffs, and that it sounded like Amazon was going to start letting us know how much more something was going to cost because of the tariffs, but has been threatened in some way. And they're saying, oh, well, we only meant it possibly for our low-end products. We have a special thing for the cheapest products, but we never implemented it. We're not going to. I think it was a good idea. I wish they would do it. And I wish more people would demand that they do it. So it's just such a long list. And before we run out of time, I do want to ask you about the Equal Rights Amendment, because you wrote, and I'm going to read, you said, consider the plight of the Equal Rights Amendment, which simply says, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And you described it. It was passed overwhelmingly by Congress in 1972. So we're talking about more than 50 years ago. And it's been confirmed by the correct number of states, but it hasn't been implemented. It was ratified by 38 states, and it's still not part of the Constitution. I, as a woman, was never in the Constitution in the beginning. Black men weren't in it. Then black men got the right to vote before women got the right to vote. But it still says all men are created equal. It doesn't say all men and women or all people. I want to be in that Constitution, and I don't get why anyone is resisting. Do you think there's any chance in this administration? Donald Trump said he wants to help women, whether we want his help or not. Well, Donald Trump could help us by passing the ERA.
I've never understood the opposition to the ERA. You read it aloud. If there's any non-controversial statement, it's the ERA. And yet I see 0% chance that Donald Trump will be part of this administration putting it in the Constitution. I'll tell you the path for it to happen.
Oh.
And actually, it could happen in 2 years. The way it could happen is the House and the Senate each pass a resolution that the ERA is properly ratified. When the 14th Amendment was adopted, there were some of the same issues. Some states had rescinded their ratification. For the ERA, some states have rescinded their ratification. But Congress nonetheless passed a joint resolution saying, we have the requisite 3/4 of the states, counting those that have rescinded their ratification. And the Supreme Court later said, it's up to Congress. So if the House and the Senate pass joint resolutions that the ERA is properly ratified, it's part of the Constitution. And President Trump can't veto those resolutions. The president plays no role. Now, with this House and this Senate and the symbolic politics surrounding ERA, not going to happen in the next 2 years. If the Democrats take the House and the Senate, though, in 2026, then it really could happen.
So you've given everyone listening to this show another reason to vote in 2 years, in the midterms, elect a Democratic House, elect a Democratic Senate. And women, if you're listening, you have to get out and vote to make sure that we get equal rights. When I started work, help wanted ads read help wanted male, help wanted female. And women could not apply for the male jobs, even if they had the skills. We now have Hegseth saying, let's change the rules for women. No one's asking for special treatment for women. Women in the military have to meet job-related skills. They don't have to run faster than, if you're a drone operator, you don't have to run at all. You're sitting using hand-eye coordination. So no problem with having rules that relate to the job. Just don't make these crazy rules that are you have to run a certain distance in a certain time and carry 100 pounds. No, that's not necessary for most jobs in the military.
Can I also say something that President Trump did last Wednesday is directly on point to that? It didn't receive much media attention because it seems technical with regard to the law, but it's exactly on point. Congress, by statute, has said that you can prove employment discrimination by showing there's a discriminatory effect against women or blacks. You don't need to prove that it was purposeful. So if there's a requirement for being a police officer or a firefighter that is unrelated to the job and it has a discriminatory effect against women, that violates Title VII. The Supreme Court has said the same thing with regard to voting. If you can prove that a state's voting rules have a discriminatory effect against blacks, that's sufficient for a violation. You don't need to prove a discriminatory intent with regard to black voters. The same thing with regard to housing. Last Wednesday, President Trump issued an executive order saying he directs all federal agencies, and especially the Justice Department, not to enforce federal laws that allow for liability based on discriminatory impact and to change any federal regulations to that effect. So what he's trying to do is to undermine exactly what you said, laws that require that employers justify that the requirements for the job really are job related.
Oh, I only hope that the Supreme Court will understand this, because it will eventually get to them. And they need to understand what's going on. They gutted part of the Voting Rights Act by saying, or as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said about abortion, it's like putting away your umbrella because you're not getting wet in a rainstorm. Obviously, that's insane. And the same thing would be true here. We need to make sure that things are relevant. When I was general counsel of the Army, we were opening a lot of military jobs to women. And all we required was that they be able to do the job. They don't have to do, if you wanted to be a radio operator back then, you did have to carry 100 pounds and you had to march a certain amount of distance because that's what was required for the job. But you didn't have to do that for a lot of other combat roles. And so I'm all for relevant responsibilities being put forth as you have to be able to do these things if it's related to the job. But any last words you want to, is there anything that you could, say that's a happy news? I mean, universities like yours are being attacked and funding is being cut off. While I'm proud to have been at Jenner, who fought back, I also am a graduate of Columbia, which bended the knee. And so I'm not happy with them. But I, what do you think? Is there any positive thing you can say to end the show?
Yes, this country has existed under the Constitution since 1787. It's been challenged before, but the guardrails of democracy have held. I think the guardrails of democracy are being challenged right now more than ever before in history. But I'm hopeful, as you say, that lawyers are going to bring the challenges and fight back, that the courts will continue to uphold those challenges against the Trump administration. And in the end, the Supreme Court of the United States will play its role of enforcing the Constitution.
I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court has learned its lesson from the immunity and what the consequences of that are. And that I don't know why I am, but I just feel hopeful that they will stand up to the loss of all of our rights and will not see things the way Donald Trump sees them. So let's cheer for democracy and the rule of law. And everyone on May 1st, go out and protest. Stand up. It does make a difference. I saw it in Watergate. President Nixon really folded when he saw the power of the community. And maybe Donald Trump won't. He's a different kind of person. But your congressman may, your senator may, when they see that they're going to lose because they aren't standing up to him. So everybody let your members of Congress know how you feel about this and how important. And remember what Professor Chemerinsky just said, which is it's coming for you. It may not have hit you yet, but wait until all the people who handle Social Security are gone. Wait till all the people at IRS are gone and you can't get your refund that you're owed because there's no one to process your tax return. Those are going to get to you. The tariffs are going to get to you. And I hope you never have to be in a court, but if you are, due process is what you want, and you're not going to get it if he gets away with all this. So take action, be strong. As my sister-in-law, Joyce Vance, says, we're in this together. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for this illuminating conversation. I really appreciate it.
Truly my pleasure.